For 4 years, the engine at Whitmore Aeronautics had swallowed millions of dollars and defeated 400 engineers. Every time at the 4-minute mark, it shuddered and shut itself down, turning each demonstration into a public disaster. When Owen Rourke, a single father in an oil-stained maintenance uniform, said the failure was hiding inside a valve smaller than a finger, the control room laughed out loud. CEO Vivian Whitmore gave him exactly 4 minutes. But when the engine roared to life and held steady, a buried file surfaced. Owen had warned them about this exact failure 4 years earlier, and no one had listened. Hit subscribe right now, because the next 4 minutes are about to flip power, reputation, and a truth that had been buried for 4 years. The morning of the 219th demonstration began the way every failure had begun before it, with confidence dressed up as certainty. Airline representatives, private investors, and half the board of directors stood behind reinforced glass at the Whitmore Aeronautics test facility in the mountains of Colorado, watching a turbine the size of a delivery truck spin up to speed. If this run succeeded, Vivian Whitmore would walk away with a contract worth billions. If it failed again, the board had already signaled they were prepared to remove her as chief executive before the fiscal year closed. She stood at the center of the observation deck in a charcoal suit, hands folded, jaw set, watching a screen of green numbers climb the way a gambler watches dice roll across felt. Conrad Voss stood beside her, radiating the calm of a man who had said the words, "We fixed it," so many times that he had started to believe them himself. He reminded the room, unprompted, that 400 engineers had spent 4 years dismantling every possible point of failure in the Orion H-4, and that this time the software patch would hold. Somewhere outside the glass, in the service corridor beneath the test stand, Owen Rourke checked drainage valves and pressure relief lines, work that kept the facility from flooding or catching fire, but never put him anywhere near a control panel. He wasn't cleared to be in that room, and nobody expected him to be. He had grown used to the rhythm of that corridor over the past 2 years, the hum of pumps, the smell of hot metal and hydraulic fluid, a smell he had once known intimately from a very different vantage point inside this same building. He kept his head down and did the work in front of him, the same way he had every day since a version of himself with a badge that opened those upstairs doors had stopped existing. The engine ignited clean. Fuel flow steadied. Turbine speed climbed through the first 90 seconds without a single flicker on the diagnostic wall, and for a moment the investors leaned forward, sensing history. At 3 minutes and 50 seconds, Owen, kneeling beside a floor drain 40 feet from the test stand, heard something the turbine's roar should have swallowed completely. A faint metallic tap, barely a whisper, traveling up through the fuel return line bolted to the concrete beneath his boots. He froze. He had heard that sound before, in a life he didn't talk about anymore. At exactly the 4-minute mark, fuel pressure inside the engine collapsed. The turbine convulsed, alarms tore through the control room, and the automated safety system did what it was built to do, cutting the engine before it could destroy itself. Demonstration 219 had failed. Voss, without missing a beat, blamed a firmware update pushed the night before, the same excuse, dressed in new language, that he had offered for months. Vivian's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes went cold, because she had heard this exact sentence too many times to believe it anymore. Investors began gathering their coats in slow, deliberate motions, the kind of quiet exit that said more than any raised voice could have. One of them, a fund manager who had already committed $40 million in preliminary financing, leaned toward an aide and murmured that this would be the last demonstration his firm would ever attend. Vivian caught the movement out of the corner of her eye and felt the weight of it settle into her chest, another closed door in a hallway that seemed to have nothing but closed doors left. On a secondary monitor near the corridor entrance, one nobody else was watching, Owen studied a live pressure curve and saw the collapse begin not in the combustion chamber, not in the software, but in the return line, seconds before any alarm fired. He said as much to a junior engineer standing near the doorway, who laughed and asked what a maintenance tech could possibly know that 400 engineers had missed. Owen didn't argue. There was no point arguing with the room that had already decided who he was before he opened his mouth. He simply asked them to inspect check valve R17. The request reached Voss within a minute, and Voss killed it just as fast, ordering security to escort the maintenance worker out of a restricted engineering discussion he had no business interrupting. Before the guards reached him, Owen turned back toward the glass and said the sentence that would end up rewriting everything that followed. The engine isn't failing at the 4-minute mark, it's doing exactly what its safety system was built to do. Vivian Whitmore heard it through the open corridor door, and for reasons she couldn't yet explain to herself, she told the guards to wait. Vivian walked into the corridor herself. Past technicians who didn't know whether to keep working or stand at attention, and asked the man in the oil-stained uniform to say that sentence again, this time to the entire engineering staff. Voss objected before Owen could even open his mouth, introducing him to the room as a contracted maintenance technician with no clearance to view proprietary design data, a description meant to strip away his credibility before he said a single word. A few engineers near the back exchanged glances at Owen's worn toolbox, his faded coveralls, the low-level badge clipped to his collar, and didn't bother hiding their amusement. Voss asked, with theatrical patience, whether Owen held a doctorate in fluid dynamics. Owen answered that he didn't need one to know that pressure was dropping before the software ever issued a shutdown command. Then he laid out, in plain sequence, exactly what the data would show if anyone bothered to pull it. Temperature crossing the threshold that triggered the high-performance fuel loop, the return valve failing to open on cue, pressure collapsing, sensors registering fuel starvation, and the safety system doing the only thing it could do, shutting the engine down to protect it. Tessa Langford, newly appointed to lead test data analysis, pulled the raw telemetry on her tablet while he spoke, and felt her stomach tighten, because the sequence matched, second for second. The official report that had gone to Vivian after every failure, however, never showed those first seconds. 7 full seconds of pressure data had been trimmed from every report for months, quietly, consistently, before anything reached the executive floor. Voss dismissed it as sensor noise unworthy of inclusion, the kind of housekeeping edit any competent analyst would make. Owen proposed something simple: run the engine again, but hold it in the low-pressure startup loop and never let it transition into the high-performance cycle. Voss called it a meaningless stunt that would prove nothing about the real failure. Vivian overruled him anyway. The engine held for over 6 minutes without a single alarm, smooth and steady, sailing straight through the mark that had broken it 219 times before. The laughter in the room died somewhere in that silence. Voss recovered quickly, insisting the result only proved a flaw in the transition logic, nothing about actually knowing how to fix it. Owen walked to the schematic on the wall, tapped a small component buried in the return line, and said the failure lived inside a valve less than 10 meters from where they were all standing. Vivian asked how long he would need to prove it. 4 minutes, he said. Across the room, Conrad Voss's face lost color the instant. Owen spoke the part number out loud, R17, a designation he had hoped no one still remembered. Tessa found herself studying Owen with new curiosity, noting the way he referenced the component not from a manual open on a tablet but from memory, the way a man might recall the layout of a house he had once lived in. She began quietly pulling every archived maintenance log connected to that part number, half expecting to find nothing, half expecting to find exactly what she eventually did. Voss pushed back hard against letting a maintenance worker anywhere near a 9-figure engine, citing safety protocol, insurance liability, and proprietary risk in the same breath, stacking objections faster than anyone could examine them. When those failed to move Vivienne, he went for something sharper, announcing to the room that this man had already been terminated from Whitmore Aeronautics once before for failing to meet the standards the project required. It was the first time Owen's old identity had been spoken aloud in that building in 4 years, and Vivienne's head turned sharply toward him. She hadn't known. Owen didn't flinch. He explained evenly that he had once served as a fuel systems qualification specialist during the Orion H-4's original prototype phase, years before any of the engineers now crowding the room had been hired. Back then, a supplier had quietly redesigned the internal geometry of the R-17 check valve without updating a single engineering drawing to reflect it, and Owen had noticed the mismatch between the arrow stamped on the housing and the way the valve actually behaved under pressure. He had asked for the entire batch to be pulled and inspected before the engine's public unveiling. Voss had refused, because a delay of even a few weeks threatened a contract the company couldn't afford to lose, and he ordered Owen to sign off on the component as compliant. When Owen refused to put his name on something he hadn't verified, he was quietly removed from the project within the week, and his written warning was reclassified in the system as unverified speculation, the kind of label that follows a person for the rest of their career. Not long after, his personnel file began collecting negative reviews he had never actually received in real time, evaluations that seemed to appear only once his old employer started fielding reference calls from other aerospace firms. Interviews that had once seemed promising went quiet after a single reference call. He never worked in that tier of the industry again. Doors that should have opened for a man with his experience stayed shut, one after another, until he stopped bothering to knock on them at all. He took maintenance contracts instead because a steady paycheck mattered more than a title when there was a daughter to raise alone, and because a man could still take pride in keeping a facility running safely, even if no one there knew what he had once been capable of. Voss called the entire account fabricated, a bitter man's attempt at revenge dressed up as technical insight. Tessa searched the archived records in real time and found no report filed under Owen's name anywhere in the system, and for one uncomfortable moment, it looked like he had nothing but his own word. Owen didn't argue the point. He simply asked the room why a man with no memory of an unremarkable, underqualified former employee could recall his name, his old title, and the exact circumstances of his departure without hesitating once. Vivienne's suspicion sharpened into something closer to certainty, the kind that no longer needed proof to feel real, only confirmation. Owen laid out clear terms. Give him 4 minutes alone with the valve assembly, film every second of it, station an independent safety team to observe, and if he was wrong, he would walk out of the facility without asking for a dime in compensation. Voss wanted her to refuse outright, but the board was watching this exact meeting through a live feed, and refusing to even test the claim would look exactly like a CEO protecting a team that had already failed 219 times. Vivienne agreed to the test. As Owen walked toward the engine bay, Conrad Voss quietly typed a message to his assistant, instructing her to purge every archived record connected to the R-17 valve batch before anyone thought to go looking. He told himself, as his thumb hovered over the send button, that this was simply damage control, the kind of housekeeping any executive might order during a crisis. He did not let himself think too long about what it actually meant to erase a warning that had turned out, 4 years later, to be exactly right. A 4-minute countdown appeared on the main display, visible to the entire facility. Voss, unable to stop the test, tried instead to turn it into a public humiliation, insisting every one of the 400 engineers on staff watch the feed from their workstations so they could witness the maintenance technician's failure in real time. Owen didn't rush into it. He confirmed the fuel line had been depressurized, confirmed the electrical system was isolated, confirmed the automated safety interlocks were engaged, moving through each step with the unhurried precision of someone who had done this 1,000 times before. He spoke each confirmation out loud, clearly, so the recording would capture every word, a habit from a career most of the room didn't know he'd ever had. Somewhere in the back, a young technician quietly noted the sequence Owen was following matched, almost verbatim, the same checklist framework taught in the company's own certification manual, a manual most of the engineers in that room hadn't opened in years. Tessa, watching from the control room, realized within seconds that this was not the behavior of a man improvising his way through machinery he barely understood. In the first 60 seconds, Owen removed the access panel over the fuel return assembly and went straight for valve R17, bypassing the sensors and controller housings that every previous team had spent weeks combing through. A nearby engineer told him the valve assembly had already been inspected dozens of times over the years. Owen asked whether anyone had actually opened the housing to look inside it, or whether they had simply trusted the arrow stamped on the outer casing. Nobody answered. In the second minute, Owen ran his fingers along the machining marks, circling the valve body. The external arrow indicated fuel should travel left to right, but the pressed seams of the internal core told a different story, the geometry running in the opposite direction entirely. Tucked beneath a layer of grime near the base, he found something else. A small X, scratched by hand, faint but unmistakable, the same mark he had carved into this exact prototype 4 years earlier, before he was pulled off the project. It meant the original flawed valve had never actually been replaced, despite every report over the years claiming otherwise. In the third minute, Owen released the locking collar, rotated the valve body a full 180 degrees, and reset it to match the true direction of fuel flow rather than the misleading arrow stamped on its housing. Voss shouted that he was destroying a component worth tens of thousands of dollars. Owen answered without looking up that the price tag on a part had never once changed the physical direction fuel actually moved through it. In the fourth minute, he torqued the retaining bolts to spec, replaced the sealing ring, and closed the access panel. The countdown stopped at 3 minutes and 58 seconds. The engine restarted. The first minute passed clean. The third minute passed clean. As the display crept toward the 4-minute mark, the entire control room went silent. Nobody breathing, nobody speaking, every eye locked on the pressure curve. The system transitioned into the high-performance fuel loop. Pressure held steady, no alarm fired. The turbine kept climbing, smooth and unbroken, past the exact second that had ended every attempt before it. For the first time in 4 years, the Orion H4 crossed the 4-minute mark and kept running. 5 minutes passed. 6. The turbine held its pitch, a low, even hum that no longer carried the faint metallic hesitation everyone in that room had learned, over 4 years, to dread. The engineers who had laughed at his toolbox 20 minutes earlier said nothing at all. Some of them stared at the pressure curve on the wall, the way people stare at a horizon they thought believing they would ever reach. In the corner of the control room, Tessa noticed someone quietly attempting to purge historical files from the central server at the very moment the engine crossed into success, and she flagged it without saying a word out loud, screenshotting the access log before it could vanish for good. Voss refused to concede the point even as the engine held steady behind him. He declared that Owen's unauthorized modification could destabilize the engine and demanded an immediate shutdown before something catastrophic occurred. Owen agreed to bring the engine down to a safe idle for inspection, a concession that made clear he wasn't acting out of ego or stubbornness, only to have Voss use the gesture against him, arguing that the engine clearly hadn't been properly fixed at all, and that the successful run had simply been coincidence. Then Voss escalated further, accusing Owen of having sabotaged the engine himself at some earlier point, deliberately engineering the very failure he now claimed to have solved, either to extort compensation from the company or to exact revenge for his old grievance. Security was summoned to the floor. The engineers who had just watched the engine succeed began to waver, uneasy about publicly siding against the man who still controlled their careers and their next performance reviews. Vivian asked Owen directly whether he could prove the valve had been installed incorrectly 4 years earlier, rather than simply now. Owen pointed to the hand-scratched X on the valve housing, but Voss immediately countered that the mark could have been carved minutes ago, during the very repair everyone had just watched. Tessa interrupted with a report of unusual access activity targeting the archive data directories, traced to a technical office account linked directly to Voss. Voss blamed a system glitch and demanded Tessa's laptop be confiscated for review, a request that struck several people in the room as far too convenient. Vivian understood, in that moment, that Voss wasn't merely defending a technical position anymore. He was trying to control both the physical evidence and the digital record before either could be examined independently. She gave a series of orders in rapid succession. Lock every server, seal the valve assembly under evidence protocol, prohibit anyone from leaving the facility with a storage device of any kind, and bring in an independent certification firm to verify everything that had just happened. Voss understood, watching her issue those instructions, that his grip on the narrative was slipping through his fingers in real time. He tried one last time to redirect the conversation, suggesting that a full server lockdown would humiliate the company in front of its own investors and hand ammunition to every competitor watching from the outside. Vivian told him, flatly, that she was far more concerned about what might be hiding inside those servers than about how a lockdown would look to people who hadn't yet earned the right to an opinion on the matter. Before the meeting adjourned, a deleted file was recovered from a backup partition no one on Voss's team had thought to scrub, a file with a name that stopped the room cold. Rourke warning: do not distribute. Tessa opened the file in front of Vivian and the assembled board, projecting it onto the main screen for everyone to read. The report had been written by Owen 4 years earlier, and it described, in precise technical language, the exact possibility that the R17 check valve batch had been manufactured with its internal geometry reversed relative to the direction arrow stamped on the casing. He had gone further, predicting almost exactly when the failure would surface, roughly 4 minutes after ignition, the moment the system transitioned into its high-performance fuel loop. In the report, he had recommended pulling the entire valve batch for inspection, a process he estimated would cost a few $1,000s and take less than a single day to complete. Instead, over the following 4 years, the company had spent more than $600 million chasing shadows, rewriting the flight control software from scratch, replacing sensor arrays twice over, redesigning the fuel injectors, testing an entirely new compressor architecture, contracting hundreds of outside consultants, and paying settlements to partner airlines for repeated delays. The archived data showed clearly that Voss had received Owen's original report and personally changed its status to invalid, without further review, before quietly instructing human resources to terminate Owen's contract and flag him internally as uncooperative. A timestamp on the file showed the change had been made less than 2 hours after Owen submitted it, far too quickly for anyone to have genuinely reviewed the technical substance behind it. Voss tried to explain that the report, at the time, hadn't carried sufficient supporting evidence to justify halting a major program. Owen asked, simply, why a one-day inspection had never even been attempted if the truth genuinely mattered as much as Voss claimed it did. The mood in the boardroom shifted entirely. 400 engineers who had spent years blaming their own skill for repeated failure began to understand that they had never actually failed at all. They had been handed incomplete data deliberately by the one person positioned to know better. Everett Kingsley, the chairman of the board, moved quickly to pause the entire proceeding, worried that a public admission of this scale would collapse the stock price and unravel every contract currently on the table. Kingsley offered Owen a substantial settlement in exchange for a signed non-disclosure agreement, along with a quiet restoration of his professional reputation, all without the company ever formally admitting wrongdoing. He slid a folder across the table containing a number with 6 figures in it, the kind of number that could have changed the shape of Owen's life overnight, paid off a house, covered a daughter's tuition several times over. Owen turned it down without a moment's hesitation. He told them that the last 4 years hadn't only cost him his own career, they had cost hundreds of engineers their confidence in work they had actually done well, work sabotaged from above before it ever had a chance to succeed. Rather than accept the money, Owen asked for something else entirely, a full inspection of every remaining valve from that same batch, including any already staged for installation in engines bound for mass production. He reminded the room that somewhere in a shipping yard, crates of those same reversed valves were likely already labeled, boxed, and scheduled for aircraft that real passengers would someday board, and that no settlement check would ever matter if one of those engines failed at 40,000 feet, instead of on a test stand in Colorado. Voss understood, better than anyone else in the room, that a full inspection of the batch would make the cover-up impossible to deny any longer. He turned to whatever influence he still held on the board, working every private channel available to him, and, within a day, carefully placed stories began circulating in the press describing a disgruntled former employee who had performed an unauthorized repair on a piece of equipment worth hundreds of millions of dollars. In those stories, Owen was painted as an uncredentialed tradesman chasing attention and a payout, a portrayal designed to strip away whatever credibility the previous days had earned him. The staffing agency that employed him received a formal request to terminate his contract immediately. Harper called her father the moment she saw the coverage, worry sharp in her voice, and Owen kept his own concern carefully hidden, telling her everything would work out the way it was supposed to. Harper reminded him of something he had told her years earlier, that a person never needed to shout louder than everyone else in the room as long as the truth was standing on their side. The call was brief, and it didn't dominate the story, but it steadied him enough to keep moving. Meanwhile, Tessa discovered that Voss had quietly ordered the entire R-17 valve batch transferred to a storage facility across state lines, officially logged for disposal, a paper trail designed to make the physical evidence disappear before anyone could examine it properly. Owen understood immediately that if those components vanished, Voss could still frame the original failed valve as an isolated defect rather than proof of a systemic cover-up. Vivian ordered the transport truck intercepted before it ever left company property. A random sample pulled from the recovered batch confirmed what Owen had suspected all along. Nearly half of the valves carried the same reversed internal geometry, all stamped with the identical misleading arrow, a manufacturing error repeated across dozens of units without anyone catching it, because everyone downstream had simply trusted the stamp instead of the metal underneath it. Voss played one final card, arguing that the engine had only proven stable at moderate output, and that Owen's untested modification could still trigger catastrophic instability once pushed to full power. The board, unwilling to simply take his word for it either way, demanded a complete full-load test conducted under the direct observation of an independent certification body, scheduled for 72 hours later, enough time to bring in outside inspectors but not enough time for anyone to quietly bury another inconvenient detail. If the engine failed under responsibility condition for altering its configurations without formal authorization. If it succeeded, Voss would have no ground left standing anywhere, no excuse left unused, no explanation left that anyone in that building would still be willing to believe. In the hours before that final test, Owen discovered that the thermal limit parameters programmed into the control software had been quietly altered, a change that could push the engine past its structural safety margin the instant it reached full throttle. He found the discrepancy almost by accident. Cross-referencing the certified specification sheet against the live configuration file at 2 in the morning, unable to sleep the night before a test that would decide far more than just an engine's fate. The margin had been widened just enough that, on paper, everything still looked plausible, the kind of change a rushed reviewer might glance past without a second thought. Owen refused to authorize ignition until the thermal configuration had been restored to its original certified values. Voss accused him of stalling, claiming he was simply afraid the final test would expose him as a fraud after all. Owen calmly pointed to the discrepancy on screen. The programmed thermal ceiling sat 14% above the engine's certified design limit, a margin that could allow the combustion chamber to overheat catastrophically even with the valve correctly installed. Tessa traced the access logs and found the change had originated from an account belonging to a technical assistant closely aligned with Voss, time-stamped only hours before the scheduled test. Vivian suspended access privileges for the entire former management team on the spot and placed Owen alongside the certification engineers in direct control of restoring the correct configuration. Owen didn't try to claim sole credit for the work. He invited the very engineers who had mocked him days earlier to verify every parameter alongside him, checking each value twice before moving to the next. That single choice did more to earn their respect than the repair itself had, because it showed them a man who measured his worth by competence rather than by settling a score. With board representatives, independent certifiers, and the full engineering staff watching, the engine ignited once more. It crossed the 4-minute mark without hesitation. Output climbed to 60%, then 80%, steady the entire way. As it approached 95%, a pressure alarm suddenly flared across the display, and for a brief moment the room seemed to hold its breath collectively, Voss already opening his mouth to declare vindication. Owen recognized instantly that the alarm was coming from a backup sensor that hadn't been recalibrated in years of disuse, and he asked the certification team to cross-check the reading against 3 independent, properly calibrated sensors before anyone drew a conclusion. All 3 confirmed stable, healthy pressure throughout the chamber. The engine reached full output and held there steady and unbroken for the entire remaining duration of the test cycle. The Orion H4 had just completed a certification run that 400 engineers working across 4 full years had never once managed to finish. The independent certifiers confirmed, in writing, everything that mattered. The valve had indeed been installed backward from the start. Owen's correction aligned precisely with the engine's original design principles. The bulk of the previous 4 years of engineering effort had been aimed at entirely the wrong system, and the deliberate suppression of early data had extended a solvable failure into a company-defining catastrophe. The lead certifier, a woman who had reviewed aerospace programs for over 20 years, told Vivian privately afterward that she had rarely seen a root cause so simple hide behind so much accumulated complexity. Layer after layer of expensive misdirection built on top of a single reversed component. She added, almost as an afterthought, that the industry rarely lost engines to mysteries. It lost them, far more often, to people who already knew the answer and simply chose not to say it out loud. Vivian turned to Conrad Voss in front of the assembled staff and asked him a single question that carried the weight of everything that had happened. How long had he known? The silence that followed lasted only a few seconds, but it stretched long enough for every engineer in that room to understand the answer before Voss ever opened his mouth. Voss insisted, even then, that every decision he had made had been necessary to keep the entire program from collapsing outright. He argued that a delay 4 years earlier could have driven away investors and cost thousands of employees their livelihoods, framing himself as the one person willing to make the hard call everyone else was too afraid to make. Owen answered that Voss hadn't saved the program at all. He had taken a problem that could have been corrected in a matter of minutes and stretched it into 4 years of manufactured failure, simply to avoid ever admitting he had been wrong. Every dollar spent chasing the wrong system, every engineer who lost sleep over a mystery that was never actually a mystery, every partner airline that walked away frustrated, all of it traced back to one man's unwillingness to say 4 simple words: "I made a mistake." Tessa laid out the evidence in full, methodically, one item at a time. Voss had received Owen's original warning, ordered the recommended inspection ignored, altered Owen's personnel file to justify his termination, trimmed critical seconds of data from every failure report that followed, attempted to erase the archived files once the truth resurfaced, and authorized the last-minute change to the thermal limits meant to sabotage the final certification test. Everett Kingsley tried to move the conversation into a closed-door session, hoping to spare Voss the indignity of a public reckoning in front of the staff he had once commanded. Vivian refused outright. She told the room that the deception had unfolded in front of every one of these engineers for years, and the truth belonged in the same open space where the lies had lived. A veteran engineer stood up and admitted he had once suspected the return line himself, years earlier, only to be ordered to abandon that line of investigation without explanation. Others followed, one after another, describing how they had been quietly sidelined from the project whenever their questions strayed too close to conclusions Voss didn't want reached. 400 people who had once stood behind Conrad Voss, some out of loyalty and others out of simple fear, began, one by one, to stand beside Owen Rourke instead. A young propulsion engineer, no older than 26, admitted through tears that she had spent 2 years believing she simply wasn't skilled enough for this industry, that every failed demonstration had felt like proof she didn't belong in the room. Hearing the truth laid out in front of her rewrote 4 years of quiet self-doubt in the span of a single afternoon, and she wasn't the only one in that room who felt something shift. Colleagues who had quietly considered leaving the aerospace field altogether found themselves reconsidering everything they had believed about their own competence, understanding at last that the ground beneath their careers had been engineered to shift under them from the very start. The board voted to suspend Voss immediately and forward the complete file to both the legal department and federal aviation regulators for further review. There was no violence in any of it, no confrontation beyond words and evidence. Voss lost everything not because anyone struck him down, but because his own signatures, his own data trails, and his own buried orders finally caught up with him in full view of everyone he had once commanded. He was escorted from the building, not by force but by silence, 400 people watching him go, and not one of them offering a word in his defense, a quieter ending than any confrontation could have delivered, and, in its own way, a harder one to survive. His footsteps echoed the length of the hallway he had once ruled without opposition, and nobody moved to fill that silence for him. Vivian turned to Owen and offered him the position that had, until that morning, belonged to the very man who had spent 4 years trying to destroy his career. Vivian offered Owen the newly created role of Director of Safety and Reliability for the entire company, a position with authority over every engine program Whitmore Aeronautics had in development. Owen didn't accept on the spot. Instead, he laid out a list of conditions he considered non-negotiable before he would even consider the title. He wanted an independent technical reporting channel, one that answered to no single manager and couldn't be quietly buried the way his warning had been buried 4 years earlier. He wanted a permanent rule that no manager, regardless of rank, could delete or downgrade a safety warning without an independent second review. He wanted every future component change subjected to full recertification testing before installation, no exceptions carved out for scheduled pressure. He wanted every engineer who had been penalized over the years for raising uncomfortable questions to have their personnel files formally corrected and restored. He wanted the full results of the valve batch investigation shared openly across the aviation industry, not quietly settled and forgotten, because other manufacturers might be sitting on the exact same supplier defect without knowing it yet. And he wanted the company to issue a public apology, not just to him personally, but to every engineer who had spent 4 years believing the failure was somehow their own fault. Kingsley objected, warning that public admissions of this scale would almost certainly damage the stock price in the short term. Vivian accepted every single condition without argument, understanding at last that protecting a reputation by burying the truth only guaranteed a far larger collapse somewhere down the road, one that would arrive without any warning at all the next time. Owen took the position, but he kept his office near the test facility rather than moving up to the executive floor, close enough to still hear an engine running through the wall. He hung nothing on the walls except a single framed photograph of Harper at her college orientation, and beneath his desk, still scuffed and dented from a decade of use, sat the same toolbox that had once made an entire room of engineers laugh. He kept it there deliberately, a reminder for anyone who walked in expecting a different kind of director, and a reminder for himself of exactly how close the truth had once come to staying buried forever. Several months later, the Orion H-4 completed its very first test flight, and hundreds of engineers gathered along the runway to watch the culmination of everything that had happened. Vivian stood near the edge of the tarmac, no longer needing to project the same brittle confidence that had defined her through 219 failures, watching instead with the quiet steadiness of someone who finally trusted the machine in front of her. Harper was there for the ending of the story, though she paid little attention to her father's new title. What caught her eye instead was a small, quiet detail. His name had finally been restored to the original technical report, the one that had been buried and denied for 4 years. Vivian asked him, watching the aircraft climb into the pale Colorado sky, how it was possible that 400 talented engineers, several of them with degrees from the finest technical schools in the country, had missed something so small for so long. Owen thought about it for a moment before answering. They hadn't failed because they lacked intelligence, he said. They had failed because for 4 years, no one in that building had been allowed to question the most powerful person in the room. The Orion H-4 roared overhead and carried the test aircraft off the runway, clean and steady, exactly the way it should have flown from the very beginning. Back inside the research center, the valve that had been marked backward was placed inside a small glass case, mounted with a simple engraved line beneath it, a line that would greet every engineer who walked past it from that day forward. 400 people can look at the same problem, and the truth will still stay invisible if every one of them is forced to look in the same direction.
Let's get it. All right. Spirit skills, RT and LT. Let's do that. Oh, look, I don't have these. Damn, Grey Wolf Mask is better. Damn, bro. Oh, yeah, that's just... It's really just jumping, though. Take your time with this fight. Won't be too, hopefully. Use the blue baby head instead of the frog. Maybe better, but the blue baby. Taxi more, yeah. Faster when you use it. You know we're playing Straight Peak. I have 3 playthroughs. One of my favorite games. Hell yeah, what's up, Koala? I'm really enjoying this one too.